This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. It's Stephen and Matthias with you today.
We're back in action per usual. Coming at you with the best topics, the coolest stuff.
Every week, and Hour of History now is on Google Podcast, Google's new attempt at like Spotify, break the iTunes Spotify market.
We're still like expanding the podcast empire.
So we've been picked up by Google Podcasts.
So we're at iTunes, Flickr, or whatever it's called. I don't know. Like I get these all mixed up. It's like Imgur, Flickr, Tumblr. Like they all have like the
Yeah.
Isn't there? What is it?
Stitcher.
Stitcher. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so when you search for Hour of History and you subscribe, hopefully, don't get dismayed if you search for Hour of History and it's not the first thing. You have to scroll down, especially since sometimes the podcasts are organized by date that they're added.
Oh, man.
So, like, if it picks up hour or something, then just look a little.
We got to put something wild in our names.
No, you know what we got to get is that sweet bump from NPR.
NPR, yeah.
Some seed money.
Everglass.
Anyway, so thanks for joining us today. We're talking about a really interesting topic that is under discussed in the world, and we'll try to break it down. We're talking about the Uyghurs.
Yeah, and I doubt that name rings a bell for a lot of people. Or Xinjiang, I doubt that rings a bell for many people.
Yeah, today is going to be a masterclass for Matthias on his Chinese pronunciation.
I know, so it's like, I know a fair amount, but Steve is the real guru here. He's been in China, he's like, it's not Qing, it's Qing. And I'm like, oh, right. So I'm the barbarian in the room.
It's funny when you take Chinese language class, the first 6 months is just pronouncing, you're not even looking at the characters.
Oh yeah. I mean, wasn't it with Chinese, how you pronounce it totally affects the meaning of the word?
Yeah.
And, also the intonation and volume and...
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my god.
So, so we're talking about Xinjiang.
Or I will just be a goober and say Xinjiang. So it's Xinjiang.
Yeah, so,
okay.
and it's an interesting name, Xinjiang. Xin is new, and Jiang means frontier.
So Xinjiang literally means the new land or the new frontier.
Right.
And so Xinjiang or Xinjiang, I'm going to just mix up the pronunciation the whole time. It's a region of northwestern China, so far northwestern China. It's huge. It's, Xinjiang is about how big? The size of...
2 times the size of Texas.
So we're talking a big chunk of territory. It's huge, but it's also incredibly isolated. So it borders Kazakhstan, Mongolia, I think a tiny bit of Russia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India even, and then maybe a little bit of Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, I think.
And to the south, Tibet.
Tibet, Jesus, yeah. So, alright, so it's a big chunk, but it's also incredibly isolated, right? I mean, it's hard to get to. It's very far from any coast. And the major population that lives in Xinjiang is a group of kind of Turkish Muslim people called the Uyghurs.
Mm-hmm. And and these people have a really long history being there because of this traditional route that used to run through Central Asia to China called the Silk Road.
Yeah, and so Xinjiang was the traditional kind of midway point, I think, from the Chinese coastline into Central Asia, and then from Central Asia you hop over into southern Russia, and then boom, or you go down through the Middle East, and boom, you're in Europe or the Mediterranean. And so Xinjiang is historically been a huge mixing point. It's been a big trading hub. Lots of different peoples have come and gone. And now though in China, it's a big topic of political debate and political repression. Because as we speak right now, the Chinese government is rounding up Uyghur, predominantly men, right? Predominantly Uyghur young men, putting them in what they term political re-education camps and trying to instill in them, the just and wise ways of the Chinese state. Because the Uyghurs, as I said earlier, are a predominantly Muslim population. And the Chinese state is sort of on a quest to stamp out Islam in China, or something like that, or at least what they would perceive to be Chinese radical or Islamic radicalism, and they're targeting the Uyghurs for that.
Right, and as Americans, we reserve the right to point out human rights violations all over the world. except
Guantanamo. What's that?
No, yeah, we'll ignore our own for a second and talk about China. But yeah, okay, so we have to get there from this long history, and it's kind of interesting whenever we get into these sort of debates of like who deserves a land, and it happens all over the world with like Israel, Palestine, or Native Americans, First Nations people. At what point do you say this was their land? Because the Uyghurs have a long history there, but the Qing dynasty actually conquers this area.
And that was in I think we're at the 1850s?
1880s and 90s.
80s. So Xinjiang before this had been, for a long time, kind of like it had been part of different empires. It had been part of these empires. And it always existed as kind of a border region to many different Chinese empires. Right. And because of that, right, to emphasize, as I said earlier, right, the Uyghurs are a Turkish people, right? They're not Han Chinese, which is the predominant ethnic group in China. So like when most Americans, when you think of China and you think of a Chinese person, you're thinking of a Han Chinese person.
A Mandarin speaking.
Yeah, and they make up about like 90+% of the population of China. But the Uyghurs are not Han. They demonstrably look different. They speak a different language. Right? They're very culturally, ethnically separate. And however, though, so when the Chinese under the Qing dynasty come in the 1880s, they establish it as like a new territory. Literally, that's why they give it the name Xinjiang. Like it's a new frontier, a new area that's part of the empire. And they kind of have to incorporate all of these people into the empire now.
Right. And China is an incredibly diverse country. So they have 56 official different ethnicities. The predominant one is the Han. And there's a bunch that, there's 10 or 11 different ethnicities that are predominantly Muslim. So the Hui are another group, and the Hui are even more interlinked into Chinese culture. So the Hui have been established. Ethnically, they're Chinese. Or pretty close to Han. So, and a lot of them are Mandarin speaking. So the only difference would be that they're Muslim. And so China has the situation with Uyghurs and Xinjiang is very different from even its relationship with other Chinese Muslims.
Yeah, because it's not. Yeah, I mean, plus two. So the way I think of the problem is, so you have this border area for a long time. It's been a major trading hub. You have this people who are kind of like a conglomeration of different peoples in Central Asia, predominantly Turkish. They're predominantly Muslim, have their own language. And then when the Chinese come in and officially say, like in the 1880s, like you are actually now part of the empire, a lot of the empire, like the empire starts to move lots of Han Chinese into the area. Basically what we think of as almost like a colonial project, right? They want to make this area part of China proper, and they don't want to have it be sort of like an ethnic enclave or something like this. They want to integrate it into as just as much of a province as like anything in southern China. And so that it gets really complicated, though, in the early 20th century, right, with the breakdown of the Qing dynasty and the end of the Chinese empire. And then you have, the war between, the Kuomintang and the communists, and kind of lost in the middle of all this are like the status of the Uyghurs and who do they have their own country? Are they a separate people? Are they Chinese? Are they not Chinese? I mean, it's a pretty messy situation.
And, just to talk about what the identity is and what they see themselves as is an interesting question. There's this fantastic book, The Sacred Routes of Uyghur History by Rian Thum, and in it he doesn't use the word Uyghur, he uses the word Altashari, because the Turkic people that lived in this area always called this land Altashar.
Yeah, Uyghur is a Chinese word, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, Uyghur is like a name for an ancient people that lived there that people currently kind of glommed onto to describe themselves, right?
Right. It's kind of, it was kind of adopted in the 30s when they had a rising of nationalist movement. So for 1 year, it becomes the Islamic Republic of East Turkestan in the 1930s.
When no one really knows who controls what.
Right, and that's sort of like during the warlord period. Japan has taken over large chunks of China, and so they have autonomy and they declare their own republic, the Islamic Republic of East Turkestan. It doesn't end up lasting, and it rejoins, the Republic of China. And then also during the Chinese Civil War, or post-World War II, actually, the Soviets go down and help establish a second East Turkestan Republic in just the northern part.
And so who knows? I mean, if things had changed differently in the 30s or the 40s, East Turkestan could have been its own way. We could have been talking about it as a separate country. It would not be part of China if things had changed slightly.
Absolutely. And that's what Thum talks about is he says when they refer to themselves or when they're talking about themselves, they call themselves Muslim or they identify with the religion.
Yeah. So Uyghur is more of an identity that's been created by the Chinese viewing these people, and then also by nationalists who kind of want to try and establish a nation state out of this area.
Right.
But most of these people, right, their identity is kind of in flux.
Right. And the Silk Road is the perfect example of how the nation state just doesn't describe a lot of the world really
doesn't
well.
work.
Because these people would have moved along the Silk Route. It's not like you would have always had one.
And a lot of these people are also they know a lot of different languages.
Right.
And then their own language status is a little wonky because there's what we call Turkish, because there's Turkic people are the majority ethnic group in Central Asia, but that's kind of a catch-all phrase because for just lots of different people that have roughly a similar culture and a similar language in that part of the world.
Yeah. And it's really that's another reason I'm really ragging on Thum's book, but it's so good because we don't have a historical record in the sense of the Western word where there's newspapers and things. So he goes back and talks to people and listens to, and they sort of tell old Islamic stories from Persia and from Saudi Arabia and those or from the Arabian Peninsula, but they change the cities and make the Uyghur areas the center. So it's just really interesting. So they kind of kept this tradition alive, slightly modified. So it's similar, like you said, in a lot of ways to these ancient Islamic civilizations, but with a twist.
Yeah, and so the major kind of why we're talking about it today, as I said a little bit earlier, was political repression, but to go back through that even more, so after the end of the Chinese Civil War, right, Mao and the communists have definitively won, and then, of course, they say, well, now we also claim Xinjiang, right, the Mandarin word for whatever that region of the world you want to call it. Well, I'll just call it Xinjiang. Altashar.
I'm going to go
East
with
Turkestan, Xinjiang, that chunk of northwestern China. And so the Chinese government, or the Chinese Communist government does kind of continue this colonial practice of the Qing that the Qing were doing in the 19th century. They move in lots of farmers or ex-soldiers into the region to try and settle it and make it kind of an agricultural area. That doesn't really work out too well because it's mostly a desert region, is my understanding, and there's lots of different mountains and lots of different climatic zones. And so ever since then, right, Xinjiang has kind of existed in this weird space within China where many Han Chinese don't really consider Uyghurs Chinese. And the Uyghurs have, I guess we would think of in our American Western terms, haven't been really assimilated, if you want to use that terminology. It's pretty loaded, right? But they haven't just melded into China and Chinese culture. They've always kind of had this separate status. And in the last probably 5 to 10 years, this has gotten very intense because China is kind of ramping up its expansionary kind of visions, and it's building right now this new, what they call the New Silk Road Initiative, which is going to be basically a kind of a super highway through Central Asia.
Belt and Road.
Yeah, what?
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, and so the thing is that initiative is going right through Xinjiang because it's reproducing the old Silk Road. Xinjiang is the central hub you have to go through to get into Central Asia and Russia and the Middle East.
And it's even more crucial because China's also heavily invested with Pakistan, and Pakistan and China have had a great relationship since the founding of the CCP. China and Pakistan have gotten along very well, and they continue to get along. And China's building highways through Pakistan that is going to connect Xinjiang to Pakistan to the Gulf, or to the Arabian Sea, I guess, or
whatever we want to call it.
Yeah. But the fact is, and then I was reading about this too, is before it's called the Malacca Dilemma. So China has to go through the Malacca Strait to get to Africa, India, or Europe. Like, unless they're going to go overland.
And the Malacca Strait is
by Singapore,
Gotcha,
Malaysia.
yeah.
And that's where all those South China Sea disputes are. So the big issue for China has been, if we ever piss off the US, they can block the Malacca Strait and we're screwed. We can't get any...
But they can build a land route.
Exactly.
And that's what they're doing now with this like new Silk Road initiative and basically building this super highway system through Eurasia.
And it's extraordinary because you trace the old Silk Road and it's authoritarian regime after authoritarian regime, and they all seem to get along with China very well.
Well, because it's you scratch my back, I scratch yours situation, right? I mean, no one wants to piss off China, and China doesn't want to piss them off, and so it's a nice buddy-buddy situation.
Yeah.
But for the Uyghurs, it's not a good situation because China, building this new initiative, wants to lock down this area and its construction projects because they see this as like a national security issue for their trade and their connections to the rest of Eurasia. And so I'm going to do like kind of a quasi, like, let's view this problem through the lens of the Chinese government. So the Uyghurs, right, are obviously, as I keep saying, like a predominantly Muslim population. And so what's also on the mind, I think, of a lot of people in the Chinese government is the chances that there could be a kind of like Muslim radical movement in Xinjiang, right? Like you get a situation like if you have in Afghanistan, or you have a situation like you have in like kind of like militants are rising up in like, you know, Syria or something. And so I think the Chinese government is terrified of that happening and kind of causing all kinds of hell for them as they're building this new Silk Road initiative. And then I think there's also kind of the rise of a weird like new Han nationalism is part of it, and kind of a new authoritarian turn under Xi Jinping. And so what this has meant is an increase in very explicit political repression of the Uyghur population and trying to stamp out what they perceive to be Islamic radicalism. But in the Chinese government eyes, that could literally just be someone who goes to mosque regularly, right? Someone who isn't even talking about violent uprising.
And I think it's important here to consider that, well, there's a couple things. So China is also facing this enormous urban-rural divide that we talked about a little in the urban-rural episode. And so as much as the Uyghur issue is related to Islam, and Islam, like, in a lot of ways runs counter to everything the Communist Party teaches about society.
Yeah, and that's not to let alone that China is an officially communist country, which is doesn't get along with religion very well.
Right, exactly. These people in school who read Marx and read what Marx thinks about religion. But it's not only that. So on top of that, you add the fact that most of these ethnically Uyghur people are completely rural, and they are not in the city, you know, or they are in the city and they're not able to compete with, say, a Han Chinese person with an education from Beijing.
Yeah, and well, because also with this initiative is the government is moving in more and more Han Chinese into the area to try and build it up and make it economically more viable and build infrastructure around this new highway they're building. And again, like you said, Steve, that's making all kinds of tensions, right? Because if the Uyghurs can't get jobs, right, they kind of get locked out of job opportunities in the cities, which again leads to all kinds of economic, you know, kind of strife of, you know, poor Uyghurs in the countryside against, you know, more well-to-do Han in the city. And then, of course, you know, kind of discrimination, the whole 9 yards about Uyghurs trying to do any kind of mobility or move around.
And then whenever you take away someone's freedoms and don't provide them with economic outlets, like, that's a recipe for disaster. And so, like, in 2009, it boiled over. But in 2009, the catalyst actually for these protests that happened was the jailing of Rebiya Kadeer. She was a Uyghur leader, you know, and so the part of the Communist Party is like, and part of this thing socialist governments do is they bring in, you have an ethnic representative kind of thing that sits in
First
the Communist
among equals,
Party.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like this woman was she's a millionaire, you know, she's been very successful in business in China, and she was representing China, the Uyghurs in the Communist Party anyway. What happens was riots started, and this is 2009, so after Tibet had been rioting, and Tibet had sort of been the problem province, for a long time. And then in 2009, the Uyghurs start rising up, and China was already so adept at crushing protests in Tibet that, a lot of the things they did in Tibet, they just rolled over to Xinjiang. In fact, the current communist head in Xinjiang, Chen Quanguo, he was trained in Tibet.
Wow.
He used to administer Tibet, and one of the things he instituted was this system of local police. So, it's kind of like the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution in Cuba, where every neighborhood has a police station and policemen. And they're taken from the indigenous population.
Yeah, no, that's what a lot of different, that's what the Nazis did.
Empire.
Yeah, but that's because it's smart. You want to lock down a population, you use their own people against themselves in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then that way the animosity of police repression isn't against the state, it's against your neighbor or something.
And you don't have a job? Well, Chinese police.
Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of forces the population to get more integrated into the state.
And it also divides them, because what do you think about your neighbor who now works for the guy who won't let you go to the mosque?
Not a fan. Yeah. And so it builds animosity in the population. It's a very devious
straight
strategy.
Out of the Western imperialist playbook. This is how Britain ran India for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And so that's been happening. On top of that, not just kind of discontent and protests and riots in Xinjiang itself, has been a handful of terrorist attacks by Uyghurs in other parts of China. I think it was 2014, there was a big stabbing that was led by a group of Uyghurs in the city of Kunming, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is in the southwest Yunnan province. And they killed at this train station.
50 people or something, yeah?
I think they killed 29 and they wounded 100 plus. Because there's really good gun control, so you can't get guns, but they could stab the hell out of people. And so that's also been kind of part of the Chinese kind of justification or propaganda push, is claiming that the Uyghurs are susceptible to radicalization. And that the Chinese government, they have to manage this population with a strong hand to prevent chaos in the rest of the country or something.
And the playbook, once again, talking about how they use the, sort of imperialist form of policing, the playbook on the anti-Islam is straight out of the West. They aim to ban veils.
Well, yeah, it's backward, it's barbaric, it's not civilized.
But the articles and stuff that come out almost identically mirror the kind of thing that you'll read in Western media.
Yeah, well, I think part of that is that after 9/11 and when we declared, the global war on terror, I think for many kind of the leadership in China, it was kind of a green light for them to kind of get their hands dirty in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, because they could always justify it to the international community as we're part of the global war on terror. See, we're fighting, Muslim terrorists in our own borders. And of course, the US government traded all kinds of weapons and military surveillance hardware to China after this. So I think that's also part of how they why those articles mirror it, because China realizes that's the best way to portray what they're doing.
And they've seen it wildly successful.
Yeah, because then, some neoconservative columnists in Washington Post or whatever will be they're protecting their sovereignty.
This is where it gets really weird, because the the internet trolls on sort of what China's doing, it gets enormous amount of support from Trump voters are saying look at what China's doing. This is awesome. And they're making the same economic argument that the government of China is saying. And the government of China, to a degree, is absolutely right. Xinjiang now has a high-speed railroad that, they're trying to make it into a tourist site. So, kind of like a Western frontier tourism. They're studying the American expansion, Manifest Destiny. And, so Chinese tourists now go to Xinjiang, and you can get it, the Silk Road experience type thing. So, that the government would say, well, that's a good thing. Now they get jobs. They can do their traditional trades. The Han Chinese have a place to go. There's a road now. So this is the economic argument. And there's certainly merits to it, but in our polarized world, it's like people are using this as an example.
Yeah, but what's been more intense than all of this, which I think is sort of like run-of-the-mill kind of more colonial imperialist expansion-y stuff, is in the last, I think honestly only in the last 2 or 3 years, is this massive kind of roundup of Uyghur men. This has been something that Xi Jinping has really ramped up just in the last couple of years, of basically monitoring the population, right, through all kinds of surveillance stuff. And anybody who mentions anything about Islam or any kind of like less than 1,000% support of the Chinese government gets arrested. And then like their friends get arrested. And then if they're talking to somebody out of the country, right, because there's a fair amount of Uyghurs in kind of diaspora, that person gets arrested and they get put into what the Chinese government is selling as political re-education camps, where it's like, we're not hurting them. We don't want to hurt them. We're just taking them to this camp or to this like nice area where we give them classes in how to be a better Chinese citizen or something like this. But that's effectively like they're basically removing the entirety of the Uyghur male population and putting them in what are concentration camps, in the literal sense of they're concentrating the population.
And sometimes the people will return, and sometimes they're never heard of again.
Yeah, and there's been a huge radio silence on this, and the Chinese government has been very coy about communicating what's actually happening. And the thing with Xinjiang that's also, I think, intense for understanding it is that it's so far away that it's incredibly difficult for Western journalists to get in, right? And it's one thing for like a journalist to go to like Beijing or something, right? But like you have to travel all the way across the country and you are totally going to be on some sort of government radar if you make it that far into Xinjiang. Like any journalist who goes there has all kinds of minders and handlers. And so and of course they're never going to show you these camps, or if they are, it would likely be some sort of like Potemkin village type situation.
Right. And the journey across is technically guaranteed. So technically reporters have the right to go to Xinjiang because China guarantees like press freedom to a certain extent for foreign presses. But anyone who's ever reported on these camps has like not become persona non grata and basically been kicked out. So we don't have a whole lot of information, but also I wanted to point out that it's interesting that Xi Jinping is of this generation that sort of lived through the Cultural Revolution, and
you and your Xi Jinping Cultural Revolution nexus.
No, but this is very interesting because all these people are coming of age. They were right at that time when re-education camps were a very big thing in China. And it's like, it's being used again, and there's not really any oversight. I was reading this terrifying story of one of the cops in Xinjiang, who was a Uyghur himself. And so one of the things they do is like they set up checkpoints everywhere. So like airport security to go shopping type thing. But then they only check the Uyghurs and things like that. Yeah. And it's just harassment, whatever. But the police are all Uyghurs too. Like this is a conscious decision by the Chinese. And then, but I was reading, so the Uyghurs get the orders, and then if they refuse on the order, like say, fire rubber bullets into the crowd, whatever, if there's a protest, and they say no, then they're sent to a re-education camp. So it's either like, you got to do your job. You want a job, so you become a police officer. Then you have to do your job, or you're gone.
Yeah, it's a very shady and scary situation. And we know that they're arresting tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people and sending them off God knows where, doing who knows what to them out there. And then with that, recently, there was a new article that just came out. What was her name, the journalist? Alice Su, talking about how there's also starting to be roundups of Uyghur children in very creepy parallels to what's happening in the U.S., and where people are like, yeah, we don't know, like they're taking children from families and from mothers, and we don't know where they are. And so that's very scary. But I think, again, it's like part of that dichotomy of China is observing what the U.S. does. Mm-hmm. And then sort of when we do it, China's like, well, then we can do it because the U.S. is supposedly the world power. And so no one can criticize us for doing what the U.S. is already doing. Or like the U.S. will take the heat away from noticing what we're doing because U.S. is always in the public eye or something.
And what's interesting is, especially, so the organizations that are supposed to do this, like Human Rights Watch calls China out. the United Nations HRC, Human Rights Council, is supposed to do the same sort of thing. And what's interesting is on a lot of these councils are seats from the Middle East. And you think the Muslim world would do more to support and to challenge China, but they've been absolutely silent.
Because of that sweet, sweet Chinese money.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So they don't really defend them. And then it's created this weird situation where a good number of Uyghurs have gone to fight for ISIS.
I think that's like something that, China claims it's doing this political repression and roundup for the sake of combating, Islamic radicalism. But that is like, it's like a classic thing where it's like anytime you try to like oppress a population, you just drive them into the most extreme position, right? And so of course all this is really doing is just driving more and more Uyghurs into the arms of radicalism, right? And then, of course, but it might be perverse. Maybe that's what China wants, because then they can turn around and be like, see, we told you the whole time that these guys were dangerous and we had to do what we're doing. And
I mean, we have on record jihadists in the Middle East, saying we're fighting for East Turkestan and we're going to bomb China whenever we have the chance. So, like, China has credible threats and evidence of this, but to the extent that they're reacting is just extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think that's also too like kind of just the Chinese authoritarian model that China just is coming out with all of its new facial recognition software where they're literally going to be able to track like over 1 billion people by face, so they can track criminals in every city anywhere that has a camera. And
Xinjiang, the Urumqi has a lot of cameras.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of this is being pioneered right now in Xinjiang in monitoring the Uyghurs. And then as well, what's like the new social credit system, which is almost kind of like a video gamification of like everyday life by the Chinese government, where it's like if you don't follow, like if you walk into the crosswalk too early or you don't tip enough or like you're literally any kind of petty thing because everything's monitored now, you have like a score that will like take away credit from you.
Right.
And you lose, like, you can't apply for certain jobs if you have a low enough score. You can't get loans. You can't move. But if your score is really good, you can get extra stuff. And so it's another way of which China, I think, is pioneering these, like, social control policies. And the Uyghurs are a really good case example or like almost like a testing ground.
And one of the ways, like, this technology works is you kind of need to have tabs on everyone, and you need to have them in a central location. So, like, China loves big mosques. So when they have a giant
so you can see everybody in
the center of the city, they can know exactly who goes. But that's not how the Islam in Uyghur areas worked. It used to be the small local community, what are the Ja'amats or something?
Isn't it like, because there was more shrines, like most Uyghurs would go to like a local shrine of like an imam or a saint or something like that.
Yeah, and totally. And, that's one of the things Thum talks about are these shrines and how the shrines were the place of history for the Uyghurs and like cultural building. And but what happened is China, it's harder to keep tabs on what's being said at each mosque. You have to look at all these different imams and these different shrines and it's a lot of work. So China's been closing a lot of the smaller mosques and sort of saying you can go to this one main mosque and then that'll be and it's kind of funny watching.
Every gift comes with a price.
Right. So so that kind of plays into the security question. There's also the freedom of movement. We've talked about that a little with communist countries. You can't really move freely. Or traveling is sort of something you earn, once you get to the higher. And so people from Xinjiang aren't necessarily free to leave and travel. Like, they can't go study abroad quite as easily as someone maybe from Beijing could.
Yeah, so it's, in a weird way, China right now is locking down Xinjiang. They're rounding up the population, they're monitoring it, preventing people from leaving. They're really kind of making it almost into, if I'm going to be kind of like using extreme language, they're making it into kind of a giant open air prison in a certain sense, right? Of, just mind your P's and Q's and we'll treat you okay, but you can't leave.
But now I'll be the devil's advocate here.
Yeah, be the devil's advocate.
I mean, they're building roads, like, through this. There's 24 million people in Xinjiang. It's twice the size of Texas, right? and there's probably 1 million cars the way China is now. Or no, far more. If there's 25 million people, there's probably like 12 million cars or something. Yeah. And so like China's introducing mass public transportation. So like the bus systems in Urumqi are some of the newest like clean energy buses and that kind of stuff. It still only costs 1 yuan to ride the bus, which is like 14 cents, you know, and you can get around the city. Like, so they have these like, it's at the same time, you know, repressive culturally, if that's what you're after, right? Or at the same time, economically creating a modern city and giving these people, you know, potential to go elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't that kind of part of like the American romance with China right now, or kind of like the weird Silicon Valley? I talked about this a little bit earlier, like another episode, but like the kind of like the weird Silicon Valley businessy fetishism of China, or of people saying, well, yeah, it's repressive, but it works. You know, it gets stuff done. And so I think you're seeing that. Like, didn't Mark Zuckerberg, when Xi Jinping's book came out, like The Governance of China, he was like, everyone should read this book. Yeah. You know, and then like, what, Trump's granddaughter is like...
Chinese? Singing in Chinese?
Yeah. And it's sort of like this weird... I don't know how to say it. Almost like this weird sense that these people think China is the future, and so we better like start paying obeisance, or that China's onto something and it's a model that we could emulate. And it does work, but at the same time, as we've been talking about the Uyghurs, if you are a type of person who doesn't fit the model of what the Chinese state wants, it needs to get rid of you, or you need to change somehow. Right. And I think that's what's happening with the Uyghurs. And what terrifies me is, okay, so right now it's at the stage of they're just rounding people up and putting them in these camps, and then maybe they'll let them go, maybe they won't. But where does the line tip over to where maybe these people get killed, or where the Chinese government might conclude that it's easier to just kill all these people rather than go to the lengths of like re-educating them, or like trying to introduce them back into their perfect, you know, authoritarian society?
Well, I think that's the fear with any authoritarian government, but I really like, if we look back at Tibet, that never happened with Tibet, you know? I mean, we don't...
But I feel like the stakes are higher in Xinjiang because of the Silk Road Initiative, and because this is such a precious project for the government, because this is like kind of their ace in the hole in taking over, well, like in expanding control into Central Asia and the Middle East and Europe.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting too, because the Uyghurs don't have the celebrity superstar Dalai Lama to come up to bat for them. So like Rebiya Kadeer, like she's fairly well known, and she travels around for the Uyghur World Congress. So she tries to, you know, drum up international support, and the Uyghurs are decidedly less sexy than Tibetans, you know, like...
Yeah. Well, there's like, I think it's also, I don't know if this is part of it, but like kind of that low level Islamophobia in the West, where it's like Tibetans were cool because it's like, oh, they're sexy, they're Buddhist, they're like in the mountains, they have like this secret wisdom, it's the Dalai Lama. Like it seems more cut and dry. Whereas I think a lot of people in the West, especially because, as I said earlier, China's basing a lot of what it's doing on the war on terror, which our country started, you know, is sort of like, I think Americans are much less open, or people in the West are much less open when we see like Muslim populations, because we're sort of like, oh, well, but they were terrorists. They were like, you know, China, it's not that bad, right? They are trying to like save their country and prevent like an Islamic, you know, kind of uprising. Like, it's a way that we can kind of find reasons to not be worried about it.
Right. And I want to go back to the land issue. Like, so talking about who deserves to be there, one of the arguments the Chinese often make is that going back before Islam even existed, there was Chinese leadership of this area.
I love that nationalist line where it's like, like you look at the history and they're like, this is part of China, and you're like, well, no, like this has always been like a Turkish kind of area for like centuries and centuries, and they're like, well, let's just go back like 2,000 years ago. Like you just keep pushing the ball back to find some moment where you can just be like, well, no one knows, so obviously we were there first.
Yeah. What does that mean? I met a girl once who said she was a Phoenician.
That's like popular with Lebanon, like Lebanese.
To be Phoenician.
Yeah, like if you ever like,
what does that even mean?
Do you follow that guy? Oh no. So do you follow that guy like Nassim Nicholas Taleb? You know, guy. He was like kind of like, he read that book Black Swan. he was like
with Natalie Portman.
No. Like he guest starred. No, he's from Lebanon. He was like a big kind of finance stocks guy, kind of a guru. And he wrote these books about like uncertainty and whatnot. And he was like hip with like the weird like libertarian-y crowd for a little while. But like on his Twitter, he posts the craziest things. Well, he'll be like, I am a Phoenician, you know? Yeah. He'll go back to Lebanon and he'll post pictures of like living in his family villa or whatever. Be like, so glad to be back in like northern Phoenicia. And he'll claim that like he's not Arab, he's like Phoenician because of like, you know, weird DNA stuff. Like it's just, it's weird because it's like people don't want to like admit, or people don't want to, it's like white people right now and like this weird alt-right movement of people like, I'm part of this like lineage of like, you know, the Anglo-Saxon race or something, right? And like, you know, it's just, it's weird.
And we're so mixed. And
yeah, it's just like, it doesn't make sense.
Chinese as well. Like, I mean, so the Silk Roads have been leading to China for centuries. And there's an enormous amount of mixing. So like when the Uyghurs will come into the news, they'll find the blondest, blue-eyed Uyghur that they can find just to be like, these are different than Chinese.
Yeah, but most Uyghurs aren't going to look that different.
No, they're mixed.
Yeah, I mean, because it's like, that's when we say Turkish as really as an ethnic, like kind of marker really just means like this mass of people in Central Asia. Cause it's so, there's no way you can try and be like, this person is this exact ethnicity or this type or this thing.
Right. Because it goes back to the Khans.
Yeah.
And the Khans wanted to they were doing the same sort of thing. When the Mongols took over, they were bringing ethnic Chinese to this area to make it more Chinese. Yeah.
But no one's succeeded so far.
Well, that's an interesting thing. So, reading about like these shrines and like sort of this, these cultures, the village cultures, it's interesting because a lot of the people who have not been able to get at their urban jobs are going back to their hometowns. So they're leaving like Urumqi and Kashgar. They're leaving the big cities of Xinjiang and they're going back to like the ancestral, like where the grandparents are still farmers or whatever. So that I wonder if that's like one of the ways that it will survive. Because I don't think the Chinese care really. Like, you can be a farmer out there.
Yeah, I think it's just, China wants space open and clear for the Silk Road Initiative. And yeah, I mean, if Uyghurs were like, we'll just live out in the desert somewhere in the mountains, I think the Chinese government would be partial to that. Like, just don't mess with our project. But that's hard too, because I think the Chinese government would also then be worried about radicalism, you know, in an isolated population. Because that's the thing too with like the pattern of like social control that China's doing is you can't have people not part of the grid.
Right.
Everybody has to be keyed into it for it to work. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm personally sort of pessimistic about what's going to happen. I mean, in my heart of hearts, I feel like there is going to be some killing sooner rather than later, just in terms of the logic of what's happening.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know. Because the last protests really were in 2009. They joined up with ISIS. That's like 2011, right?
And we're talking about a small percentage of the population. Right?
Super small. Yeah.
Like 0.5% of 0.5% or something.
Right. And again, like whenever we're talking about an ethnicity or a group, it's like 99% of Uyghurs just want to get on with their life and have, you know, they're not worried. They're just like... They just
want to be able to...
Same with Han-Chinese. Like, if you're having trouble getting a job in, say, Beijing and the government offers you a job in Urumqi, hell yeah, I'm gonna take that. Like,
yeah,
it's like you think of parallels with America, like people going out west because there weren't opportunities in the east.
Yeah. And so we'll see, or it'll just be a kind of total destruction of what we would think of as like traditional Uyghur culture and Islam in the region.
Like the English did to the Scottish.
Yeah, totally. It's funny that we do like what the English did to the Irish, you know?
Irish,
yeah. Which like when people joke about it now, it's like, oh, it's blasé. It's like, well, that was a pretty big deal back in the day.
Yeah. Like, and so they start with language. That's a big one, right?
And then religion.
And then
cultural practice.
And
you go after kids. And so
just before you do this, in the case of the Irish, it was the church in a lot of cases who stood up. So Archbishop Stokes said, Ireland will never be a footballing nation like the British. We need to play Gaelic games.
Yeah, what's the one with like sticks?
Yeah, hurling.
Hurling, yeah.
But China's being really smart about this. They're getting rid of those religious leaders, so you don't have people standing up.
Yeah, either exiling them or killing them or whatever. Yeah, and I think too they're also destroying like religious education. Like they're shutting down, basically like Islam, like Muslim schools, and they're taking kids from these religious schools and like forcibly putting them into secular public schools. They're really doing a form of, I don't know what you like. Maybe cultural genocide is like a
cultural genocide.
It's a strong term, but I think that is essentially what's happening right now. Is that China? I don't think necessarily wants to wipe out the Uyghurs, but it wants to wipe out Uyghurness. It wants to wipe out like Uyghurs having their own culture and identity and religion and language separate from the rest of the country, right? And so they're going to forcibly prevent them from expressing their culture and basically force them to join or get rounded up into these political education camps.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if I'd go cultural genocide just because of, if nothing else, for like the official rhetoric of like China has protected minorities and things like that, and people are allowed to be Islamic. It's sort of like, and a similar debate happens with the Catholic Church in China. And for years, China said, we get to appoint the bishops because we're the government.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the Pope said, no, that's what I do.
Yeah, it's like, I'm the key to God on earth,
Yeah, you don't tell St. Peter what to do. And anyway.
I am the rock of the church.
But, and so there's like that, and that tore people apart, like, what is the real Chinese Catholic Church? And, people have gone to prison for that sort of thing. So, but in my sort of perspective is like, even these Chinese Catholics that are in the Chinese church, like, so technically the bishop is not real, right? Because he's not from Rome. But they're still real Catholics. I mean, you talk to them and they're Catholics just like.
So do you think that's what China might try to do, is kind of like appoint their own imams and kind of like
totally
move, like make like, okay, there's like two kinds of Islam now. There's like state-sanctioned Islam and there's non-state sanctioned Islam.
Yeah, well, they already have the official Muslim of China Association or whatever. There's millions and millions. Something like, oh man, I don't have numbers for you, but China is sending one of the larger cohorts to Mecca every year now.
Dang.
And these are people in China who are approved to travel. So mostly HoH and like well-integrated, assimilated Muslims. But it's kind of like religion in China is super interesting too, because even reading about like these Uyghurs, it's so different from like the standardized practices. Like you can talk to someone, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm an atheist. Well, what are you doing today? Oh, I'm going to the temple to burn incense. Well, surely you think this is nonsense because you're an atheist. So you're like, yeah, I'm an atheist, but the gods are listening, so.
Yeah, it's like that weird where like the cultural practice of the religion has been so ingrained that that's just what you do. Right. It's not about if you believe it, or like that's beside the point.
And this is where the Uyghurs really hurt, because it's like, in our culture, we've gone to this mosque forever. It doesn't resemble anything like Islam elsewhere.
Well, I think like more orthodox, more intense, probably Muslims would call them like pagans, because they like go to shrines.
Absolutely.
And the gradient of being considered a Muslim is very loosey-goosey, right?
Which is why the joining of ISIS is really strange to me, because ISIS destroys shrines. And
well, but I think but look, if you're a young Uyghur man and your family's being oppressed and like your dad can't get a job, or like your neighbor just joined this police force and you're not allowed to even go to your shrine or go to mosque, and you can't get a job and you're like totally discriminated against. I can see some people being motivated to be like, screw it, I'll go join this crazy death cult of an army.
And also that's another sort of proves the point about the religion too, is that it is, they're not on ideological grounds joining ISIS. It's which I guess you could say the same about the West. It has, maybe our listeners have listened to Caliphate, the New York Times podcast.
I haven't followed that.
It's just an interview with an ISIS Canadian.
Gotcha.
And it's kind of interesting to see these parallels with the Uyghurs, and globally it's happening elsewhere too. Like, just challenges, nationalist, ethnic sort of clashes.
Yeah, it's weird. I feel like, maybe I'd be polemical, but I feel like for ISIS, their brand of Islam is more a cover for deeper like ethnic and national resentments, right? If that makes sense.
Which is, that would explain the Uyghurs joining.
Yeah, and I think that's, especially if you read some stories of other like Muslim radicals, right? Like, it's not so much that they're like these like weird religious like fanatics all the time. Like it's funny, right? Because I think like in America we just have a hard time getting it, right? Because like reading that like some of the 9/11 hijackers went to Pizza Hut the day before or something like that, or like that doesn't compute with us because we imagine, I think we just have this image of these people like, oh, they live in caves in the desert and they like are just total, you know, they're like ascetics, you know, they're like the early Christians, they're just total nut jobs. And I think it's just hard for people to get their minds around, like you can be very modern and still join like ISIS, right? They're not necessarily opposed to each other because I think it's more complicated than just the religious motivation.
Yeah, it is very complicated, and it's interesting how China has sort of clamped down as well on the sharing of information. So like one of the ways that like ISIS really reached out was on platforms like Twitter, which was banned after 2009.
Oh yeah, well plus too because they don't want any protests anywhere in China by anybody.
So China has its own versions of these kind of...
Weibo, right?
Yeah.
And then they've also got intense internet censorship, right, in China. I mean, they're really locking things down.
And again, like, I can't help but to think, like, people like Donald Trump look at this and just think, wow, how effective.
No, I think that's the sad... As we were talking earlier, I think, yeah, that's why it's hard for people in the West to condemn what's happening in Xinjiang, because the political mood is like, why can't we just do what China's doing?
Right.
You know, especially when you look at the level of China rounding people up and putting them in these camps and rounding up kids. I mean, that's, you know, I think Trump would love to just be able to like let loose some sort of federal force that would just round up like every Hispanic person. Mm-hmm. Or literally create, I don't know if this exists.
They would do like the social points. Like you do one thing wrong. And
I think they would love that. Or creating a mass database for citizens, and any naturalized citizen that like screwed up or committed a crime would lose they would love that. I mean, I think they would totally love to do that, or just put these people in these camps and just throw them right over the border, right? Like, and so I think that's the sad part is I think among the American, you know, government right now, what's happening in Xinjiang is probably more of a model than it's seen more as a model of what could be done, of what the potential is, rather than as a warning or as a grim, tragic situation.
So if I told you that I had 2 tickets to go to Xinjiang tomorrow just as a tourist, would you go?
I mean, part of me would want to go because I want to see what's happening. I want to go there, but at the same time, I would feel I wouldn't want to, because I would have to be buying into like the Chinese communist, like kind of Potemkin village thing. Yeah. Right. And I'd be giving them money and like following all their rules. And I know that I wouldn't really be seeing what's going on there. Mm-hmm. So I'd be torn of whether to, because would I be like supporting the system by going to Xinjiang right now?
And this is sort of the same question I posed at you with the Russia World Cup. Yeah. And it's like, anytime we support, like we are de facto supporting what they're doing if you're sort of buying into the mission.
Well, more than that, I mean, we sell all kinds of stuff to China, not just like consumer goods, but like military hardware, military technology, surveillance technology. I'm sure there's lots of American companies or somebody somewhere is making a lot of money right now off of what China is doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, right? It's the capitalization of social control.
I'm sure our prisons have been working with them on development because we are the prison experts.
Yeah, we are. America's the homeland of the for-profit prison.
Yeah, so I think it's all in all, it's an interesting situation. I think one thing
scary situation. I think tragic.
Yeah, tragic. Yeah. Anytime you have a cultural
bad for a lot of people.
It is bad for a lot of people, and so I think things like travel, like I know a lot of English teachers are in China. Like a lot of people go to China or study abroad in China. Now you can get a flight to Xinjiang for like rather cheap. Like I'd be interested to see more, because like you can go on YouTube and see guys just walking around Xinjiang. Like I think those kind of things sort of help the world and get the word out about these.
Yeah, I think if you were going to go, you would have to be willing to break the rules, right? You'd have to like go where you're not supposed to go, or talk to people you're not supposed to, or pay somebody to take you somewhere. I think that's what I think too, and maybe this is going to sound maybe kind of mean about journalism, but I feel like if you really want to know what's happening in Xinjiang, we need better journalism, or we need more adventurous, I don't know what to call it, more adventurous journalists,
maybe the New York Times, instead of sending people to Martha's Vineyard.
I think that's part of it too, with this whole with the West and America and what's happening, is just like our journalism has just like degenerated into just like total crap. And I sound bad because I feel bad because I feel like I'm mimicking Trump's critiques. It's not like I'm opposed to journalism, or I don't believe in this stupid idea of fake news, but it's like our news has become so pop cultured and so like, what did this famous person say to this famous person, and blah blah blah, that there's no, it seems like the initiative of like, we need to go to like this crazy war zone or this area and just kind of poke around. I don't know.
Which is why journalists...
And maybe there is somebody doing that, and if that's the case, I'm offending them and I feel really bad.
That's why independent journalists like Alice Su are so important.
Yeah, because I've been looking online to try and find books about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and there's not a lot, to be honest. There's only a handful, really.
Right, yeah.
And there's only like 1 or 2 journalists in Xinjiang who are really putting the word out.
Yeah. So, and then it's kind of like once you put the word out, depends on what word is, if you'll get back in.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So that's cool. That's a bring you up to pace on the Uyghurs. Now it's time for
pay attention to what's happening. When you see Xinjiang or the Uyghurs in a news story, perk your eyeballs up, pay notice. I hope it doesn't end horribly. I hope it doesn't go into the dark route that I pessimistically think it very likely could, in terms of mass killings and mass graves. But we will see. It's not a healthy situation.
Not at all. Yeah. So now it's time for our weekly recommendation, Mathias. We're going to give just one recommendation. It could be a book, a website, podcast, a Twitter handle.
We're like media experts now, media generators, influencers.
What is your suggestion this week?
So I've been reading the last couple of weeks, reading a lot of this Soviet writer named Vasily Grossman. And I don't know, he's like one of those people where it's like hard to pin down who he was. I mean, he was born before the establishment of the Soviet Union, so is he Russian? He's Jewish, but he's part of the Soviet Union, and he was a great writer. He was like a journalist attached to the Red Army during World War II. And then he wrote a couple really damning critical novels of the Soviet Union, both of which were confiscated, and he wasn't able to publish in his lifetime. And one of them, the KGB confiscated his typewriter, all manuscript copies, and the actual typewriter strips that he used. And so it's kind of a miracle his work survived, but he's a really great author. I've been reading a lot of his stuff, Vasily Grossman, and he just talks about all these themes about, the power of the state, Russia, the fate of little peoples, fascism, kind of all. So that's what's on my mind is this guy, Vasily Grossman.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And for me, I'm going to choose airliners.net. So it's just like a sort of in-group of people who really like planes, but pilots are on it and stuff.
For just recreational flying?
Aviation enthusiasts. No, commercial enthusiasts. There's weird people like me who like this stuff. And I just learned today, and they talk about incidents because they monitor ATC and stuff. And I just learned today in the forums of a story of Chinese pilots wanting a smoke mid-air. So they were trying to shut off the in-air fan from the cockpit to the crew so they could smoke. They accidentally depressurized the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped down because at 30,000 feet, you got only a little while before you lose it. So they had to rapidly descend to 10,000 feet. Repressurize the cabin and go back up. And apparently, it's being investigated. It was because the pilots wanted a mid-air smoke.
Wow.
So that's why I hang out on airliners.net for stories like that.
Man,
so
people will do anything to smoke. It's the hardest addiction to quit.
It is. Besides,
Steve, you sound like you're going through it right now.
I don't know. I've never smoked, but I was just thinking because social media, I think, is our generation's smoking, and it is very hard to quit. I haven't been on Instagram in 2 weeks. I feel great.
Good work, man. Good work.
All right, that's your hour of history. See ya.
Bye.